door was wide open, the apartment was empty, and the man he trusted was gone. Keanu Reeves had always believed in the power of kindness. A simple gesture, offering food, shelter, and a fresh start. But one night he returned to find everything stolen. The very man he had lifted out of the darkness had betrayed him. Had he been too naive? Was kindness just an illusion? Or was there something far more shocking hidden beneath the surface? Before we begin, thank you for being here. If you believe that some stories are worth listening to, stories that challenge what we think we know about trust, betrayal, and redemption, hit that subscribe button and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Because what happens next in this story will leave you speechless. Now, let's begin. The door creaked open, revealing an eerie silence. Keanu stepped inside, his gaze scanning the darkened room. The furniture was overturned, drawers left gaping, and the once cozy apartment now felt hollow. His breath was steady, but there was something unsettling in his chest, a quiet storm brewing. His eyes landed on the empty spot where a clock once sat, an old-fashioned desk clock he had cherished. It was gone. He exhaled, slow and controlled, before walking toward the scattered remnants of what had been a sanctuary for someone in need. He reached for the light switch, but the bulb flickered, struggling to illuminate the emptiness. The faint hum of the city outside was the only sound breaking the silence. His fingers traced the surface of the desk. Dust disturbed where the clock had once rested. He already knew the answer, but his hand still reached for his phone. Swiping through the security app, he played the footage, the grainy recording showing exactly what he feared. Daniel. The man he had trusted, the man he had saved. He was the thief. Keanu let the phone rest on the desk as the realization settled. So this is how it ends, he murmured to himself. He wasn't angry, not yet. Disappointment, however, weighed heavily on his chest. He replayed the footage, watching Daniel move through the apartment with practiced ease, collecting valuables, slipping them into a bag with no hesitation. It wasn't desperation, it wasn't an impulsive act, it was a decision, and that, more than the stolen objects, was what hurt the most. The night outside was alive with distant sirens and the occasional car horn, but inside, Keanu stood still. He inhaled deeply, letting the cold air of betrayal settle into his lungs. "I gave you everything," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The truth was sharp, cutting deeper than he expected. He wasn't naive. He had lived too long to be, but he had wanted to believe. He had wanted to trust, and that trust had been shattered. He lowered himself onto the couch, fingers clasped together, thoughts racing. He could call the police. He could track Daniel down. He could demand answers. But would that change anything? Would it undo what had already been done? His eyes flickered back to the footage, pausing on the last frame. Daniel at the door, one final glance back before stepping into the night. There was no remorse in his expression, just resolve. A slow exhale escaped Keanu's lips as he leaned back, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had been in this world long enough to know that kindness was often mistaken for weakness. But this wasn't about weakness. This was about choice. He had chosen to help Daniel. Daniel had chosen to betray him. And now Keanu had to decide what came next. The betrayal had unfolded, but the story was far from over. The rain had been relentless that night, turning the streets of Los Angeles into glistening rivers of neon reflections. Keanu pulled his hoodie over his head, his footsteps steady against the damp pavement. The city was alive as always. Cars humming in the distance, the occasional honk, and muffled conversations from people huddled under awnings, waiting for the downpour to ease. But amidst the chaos, something made him stop. Beneath the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, a figure sat hunched, wrapped in layers of worn-out fabric. The man gripped a paper cup as if it were his last possession, his fingers trembling from cold or exhaustion, maybe both. His face was hidden beneath the shadows of his hood, but even from a distance, Keanu could see the telltale signs of hardship. A slight hunch in his shoulders, a stillness in his breathing that suggested he wasn't just resting, he was surviving. Keanu hesitated only for a moment before stepping closer. "Hey man, you hungry?" His voice was calm, unassuming, as he extended a paper bag filled with warm food. The man barely lifted his head, his eyes shadowed beneath the hood. There was a flicker of something in them, not gratitude, not yet. Suspicion, wariness, like an animal too used to being kicked. His fingers twitched before reaching for the bag, unwrapping the sandwich slowly, almost cautiously, as if expecting it to be snatched away. Keanu didn't move. He just stood there, rain sliding off his hoodie, hands tucked into his pockets. Finally, the man spoke, his voice hoarse from disuse. "You don't have to do this." He took a careful bite, chewing as if his body had forgotten how to process real food. "People don't just help for no reason." Keanu shrugged, lowering himself to sit on the edge of the sidewalk. Maybe, or maybe it doesn't always have to be that complicated. He reached into his coat, pulled out a bottle of water and set it beside the man. A long silence stretched between them. The rain pattered against the pavement, soaking into their clothes, but neither moved. The city moved around them, cars swerving past puddles, people rushing with umbrellas. Yet here, in this small pocket of the world, time felt slower. Finally, the man exhaled, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Daniel," he said at last, voice softer. "That's my name." Keanu nodded. "Keanu." Daniel let out a short, dry laugh. "Yeah, I know who you are." He chewed slower this time, his posture shifting just slightly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "You ever sleep on the street before, Keanu?" Keanu's gaze lifted to the rain-speckled sky, memories surfacing like ghosts from another lifetime. "Something like that." Daniel didn't press. He studied Keanu for a long moment, as if trying to decide if the answer was real or just something polite people said to sound relatable. Eventually, he just shook his head. "Not used to this, someone sticking around. Usually they throw a few bucks and keep walking." Keanu leaned back on his hands. "Maybe that's the problem." The rain continued to fall, a steady drumbeat against the pavement. Daniel's grip tightened around the sandwich. His expression softened. Just for a second, before the walls went up again. "I used to have a job," he muttered. "A life. Then I screwed up." Keanu didn't ask for details. He knew when someone wasn't ready to share. "You ever think about getting back on your feet?" Daniel let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a scoff. "Easier said than done." Keanu studied him, weighing his next words. "Doesn't mean it's impossible." Daniel shook his head, his fingers tapping against the cup in his hands. "People always say that, like it's a choice, like I can just wake up one morning and decide to have a normal life again." Keanu tilted his head. "Maybe not overnight, but you've got to start somewhere." The rain softened, a lull in the storm. The neon lights reflected in the puddles, distorting into something almost surreal. Keanu reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded bill and tucked it inside the paper bag. Daniel's eyes flickered to it, but didn't touch it. Keanu stood, stretching his legs. "There's a shelter a few blocks down. Good people run it. They can help." Daniel stared at the bag, his jaw tight. "And what if I don't go?" Keanu met his gaze, unwavering. "Then, that's your choice." Daniel said nothing. Keanu took a step back, then another, before turning and walking away, leaving Daniel with the food, the water, and a decision only he could make. The rain had cleared by morning, but the city still carried the scent of wet pavement and lingering cold. Keanu found himself passing by the same street again, the one where he had met Daniel just a few nights ago. He hadn't expected to see him again, but there he was, sitting under the same flickering street lamp, his posture slightly more upright, his eyes scanning the street as if waiting for something, or someone. Keanu slowed his steps, hands in his pockets, before finally stopping a few feet away. "Didn't take the shelter up on their offer?" Daniel looked up, his face unreadable. "Thought about it." He tapped his fingers against his knee before exhaling. "Went there, walked right past the door, just couldn't do it." Keanu nodded. He understood. For some people, asking for help was harder than enduring the struggle. "Fair enough. You eat?" Daniel hesitated before shaking his head. Keanu reached into a bag he had brought along. He hadn't known why, but now it made sense. He handed over another sandwich, a bottle of water, and a protein bar. Daniel took them without a word, his fingers moving with less hesitation than before. Keanu sat down next to him on the curb. "You said you used to have a job," he said, keeping his tone casual. "What kind of work?" Daniel chewed thoughtfully, his expression distant. "Warehouse stuff, moving inventory. Before that, worked construction for a while." He swallowed, his fingers tightening around the water bottle. Then life happened. Keanu didn't push. Instead, he gestured toward the half-eaten sandwich. You ever think about getting back into it? Daniel let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a laugh. Yeah, let me just grab my resume real quick. Keanu smirked. I might know someone. A friend of mine runs a few businesses. He hires people looking for a fresh start. Daniel's chewing slowed. He eyed Keanu carefully. Why would you do that? Keanu shrugged. Because you said you wanted to get back on your feet. Figured I'd see if you were serious. Daniel studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. Man, you're either a saint or a damn fool. Keanu chuckled. Maybe a little of both. Daniel fell silent again, finishing the sandwich before speaking. If your friend's willing to take a chance on me, I won't waste it. Keanu nodded. That was all he needed to hear. The next afternoon, Keanu met Daniel outside a small warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, a modest distribution center that handled shipments for local businesses, but it was a start. The owner, a man named Greg, was an old friend of Keanu's. He had built his company on second chances, hiring ex-cons, recovering addicts, and anyone who needed a fresh start. Greg greeted them with a firm handshake, his gaze assessing Daniel without judgment. You got experience moving shipments? Daniel nodded. Yeah, spent a few years in warehousing before. You know. Greg crossed his arms. Look, man, I don't care where you've been. I care if you show up on time and do the work. You in? Daniel glanced at Keanu before nodding. Yeah, I'm in. Greg handed him a pair of gloves. Good. You start now. The first few days were tough. Daniel wasn't used to structured work again. His body ached, his hands blistered, but he didn't complain. He showed up early, worked late, and kept his head down. Keanu checked in occasionally, but he didn't hover. He let Daniel figure it out on his own. After a week, Gray called Keanu. Your guy's solid, works hard, quiet, but no attitude. I'll keep him on if he keeps this up. Keanu smiled at the words. He didn't tell Daniel about the call. He figured the man needed to hear it from Greg himself. That evening, Keanu found Daniel outside the warehouse, leaning against a stack of pallets, rubbing his sore shoulders. How's it going? Daniel smirked. Not dead yet, Keanu chuckled. That's a start? Daniel hesitated before speaking again. Greg's all right, tough but fair. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I forgot what it felt like to be useful. To have a reason to get up in the morning. Keanu nodded. Feels good, doesn't it? Daniel didn't respond right away. Finally, he sighed. Yeah, it does. For the first time, Keanu let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, Daniel really was ready for a second chance. Daniel had been working at the warehouse for nearly 2 weeks. His posture had changed, his steps more purposeful, his shoulders less hunched. The exhaustion was still there, but now it came from long hours of labor, not from hopelessness. Each shift, he showed up early, stayed late, and said little. Greg had started paying him under the table just until the paperwork was sorted. One evening, after wrapping up a long day, Daniel leaned against the chain-link fence near the back of the warehouse, rubbing his sore palms together. Keanu had stopped by, as he occasionally did, leaning against the hood of his car, watching. Still here. That's a good sign. Daniel exhaled, letting out a short, dry chuckle. I figured you'd expect me to run by now. Keanu shrugged. If you were going to run, you would have done it already. Daniel studied him for a moment as if trying to decide whether the statement was a compliment or a challenge. He took a sip from the water bottle in his hand, rolling it between his fingers. It's been a long time since I had something to lose. Keanu nodded, giving him a moment before speaking. You figure out what you want to do next? Warehouse work's a start, but it doesn't have to be the end. Daniel hesitated, his grip tightening around the bottle. I don't know. I can barely think past the next shift. Keanu let the silence settle between them before he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. There's a rental spot near downtown, not fancy, but better than where you are now. He extended it toward Daniel. If you're serious about moving forward, I'll front the deposit. You take it from there. Daniel didn't take the paper. His jaw tightened. You're making this real hard to say no to, man. Keanu met his gaze. That's the point. Daniel let out a slow breath before finally taking the paper. He glanced at the address, his thumb running over the creases in the page. "I don't know how to be the guy you think I am." Keanu's voice was even. "Then be the guy you want to be." That night, Daniel didn't go home. Instead, he found himself on a bus heading to a part of the city he had tried to avoid for months. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp jackets and old leather seats. Rain spattered against the windows, distorting the neon signs of liquor stores and gas stations passing by. He stared at his reflection, barely recognizing the man who looked back at him. When the bus jolted to a stop, he stepped out, pulling his hood tighter against the wind. The hospital loomed ahead, its sterile lights too bright against the night. He stood outside for longer than he should have, debating whether to go in. He hadn't been here in weeks, maybe months. Inside, the nurse at the front desk barely glanced at him. She had seen him before, seen the way he hovered near the doors, always hesitating, always looking like he didn't belong.
"She's in room 312,
the nurse said without looking up. His stomach clenched. He hadn't even asked. Daniel made his way down the hallway, his boots heavy against the linoleum floor. The beeping of monitors and the hushed murmurs of nurses filled the silence, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat. When he reached the room, he hesitated again. Then, with a quiet breath, he stepped inside. His mother was asleep. Her face was thinner than he remembered, her skin paler. The machines hooked up to her looked unnatural, like something out of a bad dream. He pulled up a chair, lowering himself into it slowly. "Hey, Ma," he murmured. His voice barely made a sound. She didn't stir. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I got a job," he said, as if she could hear him. "A real one. Warehouse work. Pays okay." He swallowed, staring at the frail rise and fall of her chest. "I'm trying, Ma. I really am." The words felt hollow. She had given everything for him. Worked double shifts, scraped by, went without so he could have what little they had. And when she had gotten sick, he had done nothing, just stood by as everything crumbled around them. Daniel clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists. The doctor had told him last time, bluntly without sugarcoating, that her treatment wasn't working, that they had exhausted every option that insurance would cover, that if he wanted to do anything, he'd have to find another way. A lot of money. Money he didn't have. His gaze dropped to her hand, thin and motionless against the sheets. He reached out, barely brushing his fingers against hers. "I won't let you go like this," he whispered. She didn't wake up. She didn't even stir. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt truly helpless. The next morning, he didn't go to work. He didn't answer Keanu's texts. Instead, he made a call. It was a short conversation, a name, a location, a number. By nightfall, he was walking into the back of a pawn shop, sliding a duffel bag across the counter. The man on the other side unzipped it, his eyes flicking between Daniel and the tools inside. "Warehouse equipment?" the man mused, running his fingers over a power drill. "Not bad." Daniel said nothing. The man pulled out a wad of cash, flipping through it lazily before tossing it onto the counter. "This should cover it." Daniel scooped up the money without counting. "I need more," the man smirked. "Then bring me more." Daniel's stomach churned, but he pocketed the cash and walked out. The air outside felt heavier than before. He told himself it was just one time, just this once. But deep down, he knew better. It was never just once. The wad of cash felt heavier than it should have. Daniel sat alone in the back of a dimly lit diner, staring at the bills stacked on the table in front of him. It wasn't enough, not yet. The pawn shop deal had bought him time, but time wasn't what he needed. He needed a way out, a way to fix things, a way to keep his mother alive. The waitress refilled his coffee without asking. He barely noticed. His mind was spinning through the same vicious cycle. There was only one way forward now. He had already crossed the first line. What was one more? The thought made him sick. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts he had avoided for years, people he had sworn he'd never call again. But desperation had a way of erasing promises. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen before finally pressing dial. The line rang twice before a voice answered. "Didn't think I'd be hearing from you again." Daniel's throat was dry. "I need more money." A low chuckle. "Don't we all?" "What's in it for me?" Daniel swallowed. "I've got access to a place. A clean score, no heat." Silence. Then, "Warehouse?" Daniel clenched his jaw. Yeah. Another pause, then a slow, satisfied sigh. That's what I like to hear. Daniel closed his eyes as the deal was made. He had told himself he'd never do this again, but the choice was already made, and this time there was no turning back. A week later, everything was in motion. Daniel moved like a ghost through his shifts at the warehouse, speaking only when necessary, avoiding Greg's watchful eye. The weight of his decision pressed against his chest, but he forced himself to ignore it. This wasn't about him. It was about her. The plan was simple. A back door left unlocked, a time window after closing, in and out. Quick, clean, no mess. No one would get hurt. That was the lie he told himself. The night of the job, Daniel stood outside the warehouse, his pulse thrumming beneath his skin. His hands were steady, but his stomach churned. The van pulled up without headlights, tires rolling softly against the pavement. The side door slid open, and two men stepped out. He didn't recognize them. That was good. One of them, a tall guy with a shaved head, nodded toward the door. We doing this or what? Daniel inhaled deeply. Yeah, let's go. The back entrance was unlocked, just as planned. No alarms, no security. Greg had never expected someone on the inside to betray him. The men moved fast, working with practiced efficiency. They loaded crates of tools, small but valuable equipment, things that could be pawned or flipped quickly. Daniel told himself it didn't matter. Greg had insurance. This wasn't a real crime. It was just a transaction. A necessary one. Then something went wrong. The tall guy, the one who had spoken first, grabbed more than he was supposed to. He pried open a locked cabinet, pulling out a heavy-duty safe box. Jackpot, he muttered. Daniel's stomach twisted. That's not part of the plan. The man shot him a look. Plans change. Daniel took a step forward. Leave it. The second guy, stockier, with a scar running down his cheek, chuckled. You're in no position to make demands, buddy. Something cold settled in Daniel's gut. This wasn't his job anymore. He had given them an opening, but he wasn't in control. He had just invited wolves inside the gates. The tall guy yanked the safe free and an alarm blared through the warehouse, a silent alarm. Greg wasn't stupid. He had prepared for something like this. We're out, the scarred man barked. The van doors slammed shut, tires screeched as they peeled out, disappearing into the night. Daniel stood frozen. His breath was ragged, his hands shaking. His entire body screamed at him to move, to run. But he didn't, because he already knew. This was the end. By the time Keanu heard what had happened, Daniel was gone. The call came from Greg, his voice tight with anger. Your boy screwed me, Keanu. Keanu didn't speak for a long moment. What happened? Greg exhaled sharply. Break-in, inside job. I checked the security footage, it was him. The weight of the words settled over Keanu like a crushing force. You sure? Damn sure. Silence. Then Greg added, You vouch for him? Keanu closed his eyes. He could hear the unspoken question in Greg's voice, the accusation. This is on you. Keanu let out a slow breath. I'll handle it. That night, Keanu went to Daniel's apartment. Empty. The door was unlocked. The few belongings Daniel had collected were gone. Only the key remained, left neatly on the counter. Keanu stared at it for a long time. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something else. A small, worn envelope addressed to him. He picked it up, unfolding the letter with careful hands. Keanu, I know you're reading this, and I know what you're thinking. You trusted me. I let you down. I won't make excuses. You told me I had a choice. This was mine, the wrong one maybe, but the only one I saw. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't expect you to understand. Just know that I never wanted this to end like this. I'm gone. Don't look for me. Daniel. Keanu folded the letter, setting it back down. His chest felt hollow, his hands strangely steady, but something wasn't right. He turned around, scanning the apartment again. Something was missing. Everything was missing. His stomach dropped as he reached for his phone, quickly scrolling through his security app. His fingers tightened around the device as he tapped the latest footage from his apartment's cameras. The grainy screen flickered to life. Daniel. Keanu's breath slowed. There he was, slipping through the doorway, moving with quiet efficiency. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't panicked. He was deliberate. Keanu's bookshelves emptied. His collector's items gone. His clock missing. His breath came slow and steady. But inside something twisted. Not the loss of the items, not even the money, the betrayal. Daniel had robbed him. Keanu stepped further inside, his senses heightened, his breath measured. The apartment felt wrong. The air was too still, the space too hollow. His gaze moved across the room, absorbing the voids where familiar things used to be. His bookshelf, once filled with rare editions and signed copies from authors he admired, now stood stripped bare, nothing left but the faint imprint of where books had rested for years. His fingers grazed the wooden shelves, dust untouched in some places, freshly disturbed in others. Daniel hadn't just stolen objects, he had erased memories. His eyes moved to the coffee table where a sleek wooden box used to sit. It had been a personal collection, small but valuable, a carefully curated selection of watches he had gathered over the years. A Patek Philippe, a Rolex Submariner, a vintage Omega Seamaster that had once belonged to his father. Gone. The absence of them was deafening. He could almost hear the soft click of winding mechanisms, the weight of history in their dials. Now there was only silence. His stomach twisted. This wasn't a desperate act of survival. This was a calculated betrayal. His steps were slow, deliberate, as he crossed the room toward the corner where his old guitar should have been. A Gibson J45 gifted to him by a close friend decades ago. The leather strap still hung from the stand, swaying slightly as if mocking him. Keanu exhaled through his nose, pressing his lips into a thin line. It had been just an instrument to anyone else, but to him, it had been a relic of a different life, a different time, a reminder that no matter how chaotic the world became, music was always a refuge. Now, even that had been stripped from him. He turned toward the hallway leading to his bedroom. The door had been left slightly ajar, the dim glow from the streetlights outside casting eerie shadows inside. He pushed it open with a quiet creak, his eyes immediately landing on the dresser. The top drawer had been yanked open, the contents ransacked. The small things were gone. The cufflinks he never wore but still kept, the ring his mother had given him when he was younger, the silver lighter he had carried for years even though he didn't smoke. It wasn't just theft, it was personal. And then his gaze dropped to the nightstand, the small, familiar space where his clock had always been, the one thing he reached for every morning, the last thing he saw every night. A gift from a director he had worked with long ago, engraved with the words, "Time reveals all." Ironic, it was gone. Keanu felt something inside him splinter. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something deeper, something heavier, a slow, creeping weight of disappointment that settled into his bones, the kind of disappointment that didn't burn hot but rather froze, cold and unmoving. A quiet realization that what he had built, the trust, the belief, the second chances, had all been shattered. He sank onto the edge of his bed, elbows resting on his knees, fingers laced together. His breaths were measured, controlled, but his chest felt tight. He replayed the security footage in his mind. Daniel, moving methodically, carefully selecting what to take, leaving behind only what wasn't worth anything. It hadn't been rushed. It hadn't been reckless. It had been deliberate. His jaw clenched. He had known betrayal before. Hollywood was full of it. Fake friends, empty promises, loyalty that vanished the moment it was no longer convenient. But this was different. This wasn't just business. This was personal. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, the city outside buzzing with life, indifferent to what had just unfolded inside these walls. He ran a hand over his face, over the stubble on his jaw, trying to push away the sinking feeling in his chest, not because he had lost valuables, but because he had lost something far rarer, hope. And for the first time in a long time, Keanu wondered if kindness had been a mistake. 3 months had passed. The apartment still didn't feel quite like home. Keanu had slowly started replacing what had been taken, not to erase the memory, but because life had to move forward. The bookshelves weren't as full as before, the new watch didn't carry the same weight on his wrist, and the replacement guitar, though identical in model, lacked the years of history the stolen one had held. Some things could be replaced, others couldn't. That afternoon, he was unpacking a small box of new kitchenware when his phone buzzed. The doorman downstairs. "There's a package for you, it's kind of big." Keanu frowned. He wasn't expecting anything. "I'll be right down." Minutes later, he stood in the lobby staring at the box. It was unmarked. No return address, no indication of who had sent it. Just his name, written in rushed, uneven handwriting. His pulse slowed. He knew that handwriting. Daniel. Keanu exhaled, steadying himself before nodding at the doorman. "I got it." He carried the box upstairs, placing it carefully on the living room table. His fingers hovered over the tape, hesitating for a moment before slicing through it. The cardboard flaps folded back, and then his breath caught. Inside, carefully wrapped, were his things. The first thing he saw was the clock, the same old-fashioned timepiece that had been sitting on his nightstand for years. He reached for it, feeling the familiar weight in his hands. The engraving still there. Time reveals all. Beneath it, stacked neatly, were the books he had lost, some with his old notes still scribbled in the margins. His watch collection, each piece tucked carefully in its velvet casing. The Gibson J45 guitar, the leather strap looped around it just the way he used to leave it. Everything was here. At the bottom of the box, there was an envelope. His name, written again in the same hurried handwriting. Keanu swallowed, his fingers tightening around the edges before he opened it. "Keanu, I wasn't sure if I should send this. I almost didn't, but in the end, I couldn't keep them. Not anymore."
Because they were never mine to take.
"For the past 3 months, I've been trying to figure out what kind of man I am. And the truth is, I don't know yet. But I know I don't want to be the man who took from the only person who ever believed in me." I told myself I had no choice, that I did what I had to do. But that's not the truth. The truth is, I was afraid. Afraid that even if I took the path you offered me, I'd still end up failing. And in the end, I failed anyway. I never told you about my mother. I should have. Maybe if I had, things would have been different, but I couldn't, because I knew what you'd do. You would have helped. You would have found a way. And I couldn't let you do that. Not for me, not for her. She was sick for a long time, Keanu. Longer than I ever let on. By the time I met you, the doctors had already given up. I had nothing left. No savings, no home, no options. Just a waiting game, and I wasn't ready to play it. I needed money, more than what I could make in time. So I did what I always do. I ran. And then I stole. I told myself it was for her, that taking from you was just a means to an end. But if that were true, why did I take more than just money? Why did I take things that mattered to you? I stood in your apartment longer than I should have, staring at your things. Your books, your watch, your guitar, and the clock. God, that clock. I hesitated, I almost left it. But I didn't. Because that's who I am, Keanu. A man who hesitates, but still chooses wrong. And I hated myself for it, even as I walked out the door, even as I disappeared into the night. I know you'll never look at me the same way again. I know this is the last time my name will ever cross your mind without bitterness. But if there's one thing I need you to believe, one thing I need you to know, it's that none of it was fake. Not the moments we sat outside the warehouse talking, not the nights I thought for just a second that maybe I had a future, that maybe people like me don't have to be lost forever. But I am lost, Keanu, and this is me finally admitting it. I won't let this be the last thing I take from you. No more second chances, no more pity. You don't need to look for me, and even if you did, you wouldn't find me. But maybe, someday, you'll hear my name again. And I'll be someone worth knowing. Until then, thank you for everything. Daniel. Keanu sat back, the letter resting in his hands. He let out a long, slow breath, eyes drifting over the items inside the box. The past 3 months, he had told himself to let go, that some people just couldn't change, that Daniel had made his choice. And yet, here this was. Proof that maybe, just maybe, Daniel was still trying. His gaze lingered on the clock, its soft ticking filling the silent room. Time reveals all. And then he laughed. It wasn't a joyful laugh, nor was it bitter. It was quiet, almost foolish, like the laugh of a man who should have learned his lesson by now, but still refused to stop believing in something better. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? Even after everything, after being lied to, stolen from, betrayed, he still believed, not just in Daniel, but in people, in kindness, in second chances. And so, Keanu did what he always did. He picked up the clock, set it back on his nightstand where it had always belonged, and let time move forward, because no matter what had happened, he knew one thing for sure: this wouldn't be the last good thing he did. If you've made it to this point, thank you. Not just for watching, but for staying until the end. That means this story meant something to you. Because real kindness isn't about guarantees. It's about choosing to believe, even when you risk being let down. Keanu Reeves didn't just help Daniel, he believed in him. And even after the betrayal, he still chose to see the possibility of redemption. So here's my challenge to you: help someone, believe in someone, even when it's hard, because kindness isn't wasted. It leaves a mark, even when we can't see it. And while you're here, hit that subscribe button. More subscribers mean more stories, stories that remind us that trust may break, but kindness endures. Again, thank you for watching. See you in the next video.